Hi, Jobless. I know it's been a while, but as you can see, I've been pretty tied up. But maybe you could untie me and I could, if I may, talk about one of my favourite films and one of my favourite subjects. I'm not flirting, I could really use your help. This is kind of starting to hurt. No wonder people are scared of kink at Pride. This shit sucks.
Secretary, written by Erin Wilson and directed by Steven Shainberg, was released in 2002 under AA Films and was later distributed by Lionsgate Films. Adapted from the set of short stories by Mary Gateskill, Bad Behaviour, Secretary follows the recovering head case, Lee Holloway, as she begins her employment and starts a scandalous, intense, and deeply erotic relationship with her eccentric but demanding boss, E. Edward Gray. The film premiered at the 2002 Sundance Film Festival, where it earned wide audience appeal and a special jury prize award for originality, and following its release, it was then described as erotic and provocative by The Times, and the film of the month by Uncut Magazine.
Now, I know that I'm usually a horror person who talks about blood and gore and scary stuff, but hey, I contain multitudes. Some of my favourite movies are in fact romances and rom-coms, and what's scarier than trying to date in 2025? But seriously, if you can believe it, these movies actually share more in common with horror than you might think.
As discussed by the Centre for the Study of Women in Television and Film and their article, It's a Man's Celluloid World, portrayals of female characters in the top-grossing US films of 2024, where we will see predominantly male heroes in other genres such as action, crime thriller, science fiction, and others, horror and romance are predominantly female-led and occupied by female characters. We have terminology referencing this prevalence in both genres, the final girl and scream queen for horror, and the chick flick for romance and rom-coms. And when you think about it, this connection isn't all that surprising at all, since both horror films and romance films, not always, but often, depict women persevering through and triumphing against relatable struggles, like being chased by a slasher villain trying to kill you, or getting the perfect job and the perfect date in an oppressive urban environment.
I mean, it's basically the same thing, right?
Similarly, both genres inspire a lot of discourse regarding the progressive or regressive nature of these depictions, are often denigrated by wider society and cinephilia, and are actively removed from what we consider to be high art by the Academy and general cinematic gatekeepery. Horror is proclaimed to be a misogynistic genre enjoyed by misogynists, worthy of scorn and contempt.
These films hate women, and unfortunately the audiences that go to them don't seem to like women too much either.
And the amount of moral panic that seems to surround romance novels and films is laughable and overdone, yes, but repeats the patterns associated with romance novels since their very conception. These aren't texts worthy of respect and accolade, and if they are, they're a particularly strong outlier that doesn't speak for the rest of the bunch.
Snap out of it!
And I don't want to say that this denigration and contempt comes down to misogyny, but it kinda does all come down to misogyny.
There's a certain level of condescension that is levied at the creators and consumers of horror and romance alike, the feminist bibliothecary observes. They're cheesy, they're not believable, they aren't as good as the real art, with this real art always being old, white, and male, of course.
I wonder why that is. There's also something to be said about the reception to these films, rom-coms especially, both from a critical level and a consumer one. We use terms like guilty pleasure, syrupy, saccharine, treacly, which suggests that there is no nourishing artistic sustenance to be had here. In essence, women are positioned as a non-discerning audience, easy to market corporate slop towards in spite of the power behind their purchases. There's a reason that people turn to horror and romance in an economic crisis after all.
While some feminist critics have spoken on both horror and romance being regressive genres, replicating a heightened version of patriarchy and pushing the societal norms of puritanical heterocentric culture, those being a focus on the virginal good girl and punishing or correcting those who don't adhere to the rules of both horror and romance, the continued and predominantly female fandom surrounding these texts cannot and should not be ignored, nor should their voices be brushed off as supporting that which is overtly patriarchal, especially when we're conscious enough about these rules to acknowledge them and even make fun of them.
It was right. It was real. It was
a movie. That's your problem. You don't want to be in love. You want to be in love in a movie.
After all, the very notion of women enjoying especially titillating romance or blood-curdling horror goes against the social prescriptions and stereotypes of womanhood and femininity, allowing women of all ages, classes and creeds to centre their experiences and see their pleasures, whether those be for realistic female-led horror or lovey-dovey romance realised on screen. And maybe you haven't been chased by a slasher villain or had something alien crawl out of your body, but you've probably felt the emotions close to it. Similarly, maybe you haven't been so in love with someone that you interrupted their wedding just to tell them you love them, but you've probably been in love before, and not being with someone you love has felt just as heartbreaking. Women's fears and their concerns are taken seriously in horror and romance, and not sidelined in favour of male endeavour or patriarchal desires. Horror is an outlet, a cure to alienation. It's about connection and being seen, and being able to see your experiences realised on screen, even if it happens to be in a heightened, hyper-realistic and potentially problematic way, which is also, by the way, what romance is about.
And I will say, I do think that the landscape for both horror and romance has changed for the better, and that we are beginning to understand what appeals these audiences to these films.
As of late, the notion of the horror film and the romantic comedy being uniquely positioned to explore women's experiences is one that is becoming readily accepted, and also one that has elevated these genres into the space of the academy and academic intervention. While horror usually makes me want to look away, Lydia then writes in reference to films like The Substance, a critical darling that was nominated for an Oscar, seemingly in spite of its bonkers conclusion, I found myself leaning into these darkly comic and deeply unsettling portrayals of female experiences, brought to us using classic horror tropes that often feel overly gratuitous to me. Similarly, where people may have scoffed at the idea of romantic comedies being culturally significant, others are seeing the potential for old and new narratives to explore the unique challenges posed by love, and, refreshingly, exploring these challenges outside of the space of the exclusively cis heterosexual white couple too. I think these female filmmakers have been at the forefront of creating the romantic comedy. They're not girl movies, they're for everyone. But it's incredible how this genre has given opportunity for women to take charge of their narratives and tell stories that intrigue women, men, and everyone alike.
And while these new interpretations are great and important, and I love seeing women being able to centre their enjoyment in the space of horror and romance, I can't help but feel that one genre that perhaps encompasses the questions of horror and the rom-com the best of all, and one that certainly centres female enjoyment and pleasure, is being a little left behind. And maybe there's a little misogyny rooted in why that is too. Which is why this video essay is going to explore Secretary as a radical film that it is. A film that, while presenting intense eroticism, also crafts a distinct and rarely replicated portrayal of female pleasure and agency within the romance genre.
We'll look at the film's colours as a visual language for Lee's empowerment, then see how the story flips typical romance tropes to highlight her desires. Finally, by contrasting the film with other texts that, in my opinion, perpetuate misogyny and anti-kink sentiments, this video will highlight Secretary's groundbreaking depiction of a woman actively constructing a romantic and sexual reality centered on her own pleasure. The film begins with Lee leaving a psychiatric hospital and immediately attending her sister's wedding, letting us, the viewer, understand that this isn't going to be a traditional romantic comedy that ends with a wedding. This is something else entirely. Or is it?
Pin in that.
The screenplay describes Lee as emotionally fragile and mildly deranged, a character trait that the novel's protagonist, Debbie, lacks, who also lacks Lee's backstory in the psychiatric hospital. She is anxious, closed off, prone to self-harm and suicidal ideation, and she immediately comes across as someone who needs a lot of time and attention and care. Traditionally, and certainly cinematically, these are traits associated with childhood, or a film which centres around exploring a potential disability, characters which are largely inert and certainly sexless, as opposed to traits for a young woman in a romantic comedy. However, there is an arguable connection between Lee's initial inerted womanhood and her later behaviour in the film, and the proclivity towards female humiliation in the rom-com genre. Women must not only be gorgeous and financially successful, with jobs as writers, museum curators, editors, etc., they must fall down and then sob, knowing it's all their fault. The question of can women have it all was really about if women can date successfully, have good jobs, and not spill coffee down themselves 24/7. Terrible jokes aside, where this lean towards female slapstick roots the rom-com in the first depictions of female comedy, where TV's lack of visual intensity freed female performers from the cinematic drive and opened up opportunities for more active modes of performance such as joke making, I do think that these more humiliating inclusions serve to make rom-com protagonists more relatable. Like, I certainly don't look like Renee Zellweger, but when I see her make a wardrobe mishap in Bridget Jones's Diary, I see myself in her and feel that much more endeared to her. And maybe the same can be said for Lee's vulnerable past in Secretary.
I swear, if this video does well, I'm totally going to do an entire video essay about how much I love Bridget Jones and why it should be the only film England is known for. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Getting back to Secretary, the hospital is the only place that Lee felt relatively comfortable and is accommodated for without needing to give anything in return. And she admits to herself that she is hesitant to leave the order that it established for her because of that.
I'd started to get used to the place. Breakfast at 8, classes at 2, therapy at 4, and asleep by 10.
You can call me anytime, Lee. I will always try and be of help to you.
Inside, life was simple.
And upon leaving the hospital, she is almost immediately met by the narrative and her societal expectations as a woman to marry and to mother, to sacrifice her desires and, quite frankly, her needs, and play her role as woman. Lee stands awkwardly amidst the wedding reception, attends to her drunk father, and makes small talk with her high school sweetheart, as women tend to do in the romantic comedy genre, in a frumpy blue dress, a typically masculine colour which signifies calm and loyalty, while also signifying fragility, depression, and even coldness, and marking her as substantially different to the other women in the cast. While her mother and her sister dress in the pure innocence of white and surround her in pink, symbolising love, nurturing, a well-known trait associated with wives and mothers, and compassion, and light purple, associated with light-hearted romantic energies, Lee is forced to live in an infantilized state of perpetual girlhood, her bedroom decorated with toys, butterflies, sparkles, and ballerina figures. Taking into consideration Lee's mental illness and history with self-harm, her family cannot seem to see her for the woman she is, and insist on forcing a kind of age regression upon her, while simultaneously pushing their gendered expectations onto her too. She will date her high school sweetheart, and she'll get married to him and live close to home, just like her sister does.
This proclivity towards colourful storytelling not only elevates Secretary to being an especially beautiful film to look at, and one rich with potential academic intervention from a cinematography level alone, but also clearly distinguishes Lee and her narrative arc away from prepubescent girlhood and into the space of womanhood.
Instead of following Lee's route to getting married, joining the group of giggling women in bikinis that her sister hangs out with, or playing mother like the quasi-abused stay-at-home wife her own mother represents, she is determined to move away from these expectations of her and give herself a structure outside of the boundaries of the psychiatric hospital. She goes to school, gets a typing qualification, and begins her job hunt, before donning herself in a blue vinyl raincoat, once again displaying her difference and calm fragility, and quickly finding work as the titular secretary for the elusive and intense E. Edward Grey, and their working relationship becomes, well, a little more than intense very quickly.
Now, returning back to colour theory, if Lee is Secretary's blue, calm, fragile, and loyal, Grey is almost certainly Secretary's red.
Red pops up a lot with Grey in spite of his namesake. His office contains highlights and pops of red, he dons maroon suits, he works out in an uncomfortable-looking red sweatshirt, and, of course, he assesses Lee's work with a red marker. Pin it net. Red immediately inspires passion and heat, and is known to stimulate the senses, increase heart rate, and create a sense of urgency and authority. Red is also, unsurprisingly, associated with dominance and power, alerting our attention and marking someone as especially physically attractive, inspiring an increase in what psychologists call arousal, a physiological measure of excitement, at least in this case.
So, if red implies heat, authority, and power, and blue implies cold, loyalty, and calm, the association of red and blue with dominance and submission is a pretty natural one to make. And what does red and blue create when it is combined? It creates purple. Pin in that too.
To reference the screenplay again, Grey is a unique, old-fashioned but off-centre, in-charge boss with a somewhat sadistic sexual proclivity towards dominance and sadism. But where this description might have characterised Grey closer to his and other book counterparts, a cruel and domineering tyrant whose relationship with Debbie more closely echoes conversations we have surrounding #MeToo and sexual abuse in the workplace, the filmic language distinguishes Grey as kind of a perfect gentleman. Awkward and closed off, yes, without question he is the most isolated man that's been known, and he arguably demonstrates just as many neurotic and mildly deranged traits as Lee does, making them that much better suited for each other, but clearly capable of the strong nurturing care that Lee needs and yearns for. Importantly established before we even see Grey himself, Grey grows and nurtures purple orchids in his in-office garden, a famously difficult to maintain flower which symbolises strength and endurance, as well as love and indulgent opulence. And we cut to Grey often admiring and caring for these plants. There's a lot of references to flowers, gardening, and returning to the earth through Secretary. And it's also not at all controversial to say that orchids, and flowers as a whole, are especially yonic when it comes to erotic imagery, housing pools of perfume in which bees drink and wade and drown.
This association is a somewhat complicated discourse to get into, of course, especially when considering an artist such as Georgia O'Keeffe, who could not display her paintings of flowers without them being dogged with erotic interpretations, in spite of how much she vehemently denied it for over 6 decades of her career. And while I agree that she shouldn't have had to consistently insist that her paintings were non-sexual to a largely cis male audience, I really don't think the issue lay with flowers looking like vaginas, because they just kind of do.
And perhaps because of this, Secretary uses this imagery often, with Grey feeding the orchids in such a way that replicates phallic penetration, but with a delicacy and slowness not traditionally associated with such. If we were to elevate this imagery in the narrative, Grey is a nurturer and carer of femininity, or at least of the cis-femininity that Lee represents in this film, and this attention and care immediately distinguishes him as, well, a sort of caregiver that Lee yearns for, a semi-common archetype if we were to discuss dominance and sadism IRL. Perhaps recognising this more caring side to him while he is still so closed off, Lee is almost instantly drawn to Grey the second they meet, and quickly clads herself in his hues of red and black, distinguishing herself as a professional woman and not the stunted girl that she once was in her childhood bedroom. And Grey too is drawn to Lee, having a clear interest in her right from the get-go, and he gradually introduces flashes of her blue in his own wardrobe. They haven't mixed just yet, though there are hints towards it, especially from Lee, but they are allowing the other to have an impact on their lives. But speaking of impact...
For referring...
Whether she expected it or not, Lee finds herself, her sexual agency, and, significantly for the film, her interest in dominance and submission in their hues of blue, red, purple, and black. In the spaces constructed and silently communicated between the two of them, removed from the regressed and deeply gendered expectations established by her family, Lee is allowed and encouraged without an iota of pressure to embrace a sensual and erotic version of nurtured femininity, and one where her pleasure matters first and foremost. Whether that be through pain, humiliation, praise, or through the hesitant eye contact she has with the man she pines for.
Editing Ray here. Hello. I just wanted to quickly interrupt to address a criticism that I occasionally see about this film, through the suggestion that Lee and Grey don't properly communicate their dynamic and therefore present a problematic representation about BDSM. I do agree that these direct communications are not only important, they're a fundamental facet of a successful BDSM dynamic. I think assuming that they don't communicate about it is doing the film a bit of a disservice. Through the use of the fetish montage, it offers us glimpses of their developing relationship, while letting our brain fill in the gaps of what develops around it, which I think suggests that they've communicated plenty. And while, yes, Grey does sort of initiate the first spanking without communicating to Lee first,
while also giving her plenty of opportunity to opt out, but whatever. There's an obvious permission to continue granted by Lee through the touch of her finger to his, an inclusion that Maggie Gyllenhaal fought to include to further assert Lee's agency. Lee even uses a safe word in the middle of an argument later in the film, suggesting further that they've discussed this between themselves. I also love that the film keeps Lee's interest in sadomasochism as part of her character, even when removed from her dynamic with Grey. Some texts kind of imply that a woman's interest in fetish is only tied to her one relationship, but Lee actively goes searching for other doms, and even acts as a dom herself for a mismatched partner. She might find ultimate fulfillment with Grey, yes, but her kink is not limited to him and him alone. I don't know. I like that inclusion. Felt a bit more real.
I think there's a hidden sweetness in Sincerity to Secretary, a sweetness that is sort of ignored or unrecognised by those who willfully dismiss it or even fairly criticise it as a sexist fantasy of a man with too much power over a vulnerable woman. For one, both the short story and the film are written by women, thereby centering their perspective on the subject and making both protagonists that much more representative of real female experiences.
As well as that, inside and kind of outside of their dynamic, Grey has the capability of being deeply nurturing and caring, and he really does act like kind of a perfect gentleman to Lee, outside of his rom-com typical communication issues. He encourages her to stand up for herself, separate herself from the suffocating family dynamic of her parents and sister, stop self-harming, indulge in her pleasures as and when she wants to, and gives her a structure and routine that she needs after coming out of the psychiatric hospital at the beginning of the film. Perhaps this is something available to him through patriarchy, the comfort and pleasure in telling a woman what to do, though he does beat himself up about this pretty badly. And perhaps there is criticism to be made about Lee needing a male caregiver after her father failed her, but I don't think that mitigates the sincerity and sweetness behind their relationship. Indeed, for all its potential shock value and the upfront manner of which it's marketed, the film's sadomasochistic content was made explicit, it's a surprisingly tender tale about a complex relationship between complex people. Ignoring that sweetness is ignoring the wide-eyed stare and idle tongue twitches from Lee as she listens to audio tapes about sadomasochism and types out letters full of spelling errors just to give her boss a reason to punish her. It ignores the erratic workout sessions Grey has in his office when he can't keep all of his emotions inside in spite of his artificially unshakable exterior that sees frequent shakes and stumbles as he gets closer to Lee. It ignores the shy smiles between them when they drink hot chocolate and take Polaroid pictures, when Grey tells Lee without words that she has no reason to self-harm anymore because he is going to take care of her, barely half an hour into the film, fulfilling the one thing she actually wants and removing the gendered expectation of her sole care for him in lieu of something stronger and much more authentic. It ignores the hues of her blue and his red shifting into purple as the two grow closer and closer together.
To interject for just a moment on my favourite subject, I think James Spader's casting as Grey makes the film that much stronger too.
I mean, for one, while I think he's gorgeous, he's not the typical lead you would see in a movie like this these days. I mean, just look at Jamie Dornan's casting as the uber-serious Robodom Christian Grey in the 50 Shades franchise, or Harris Dickinson's cocky beginner dom Samuel in Baby Girl, and compare it to this. In Secretary, Grey isn't portrayed as a walking set of abs who barks orders and knows absolutely everything there is to know about BDSM while keeping his clueless sub in the dark. He's shy and awkward, and he visually struggles just as much with his desires as Lee does, and that not only makes the character feel that much more alive and human, but also makes him a lot sexier.
To me, anyway.
The same is also done through Shainberg's other erotic foray with James Spader, Sex, Lies and Videotape, in which he gives women the space to discuss their sexual fantasies without the suggestion of having sex with them himself, even if Andie MacDowell does admit that she wants to have sex with him, because why wouldn't she? In recording the women's monologues, he is allowing women to narrate their own inner sexual lives uninterrupted and without putting a patriarchal narrative upon them. They're simply allowed to just be. I think the thing I find most interesting about Secretary, and sort of what I find interesting about some of its responses online, is that throughout the film, Lee has full agency of what she's doing with Grey. Initially presented as a submissive who gradually asserts her own agency and desires, therefore challenging the notion that power must be wielded in a singular and unidirectional manner. Grey might be the dominant male, but it is always Lee who is leading the charge of their relationship and wanting more, even when Grey retreats, thereby inverting their work roles in which the secretary is the caregiver.
I just wanted to add additional fuel to the argument of Lee's agency and Grey's nurturing that I've spoken about through this essay. In a scene towards the beginning of the film, Lee is setting up a mousetrap for the office, giving her something to do, and Grey a glimpse of what's up her skirt. And while this might be a throwaway scene, a representation of Lee's labour as Grey's secretary, in spite of Grey being the one to actually set up the trap, later on in the film, Grey is opening the trap and letting the mouse inside free, visually representing his and Lee's dynamic as something similar, superficially imprisoning while the intention of freedom is always surrounding it. It also establishes Grey as especially caring, humanely freeing the mouse as opposed to killing it. I remember once when I worked retail, my boss mentioned in a staff meeting that we had rats in the store and he'd have to set up traps for them. One of my co-workers immediately said, "Humane traps, right?" And the other guys I worked with laughed at him, because God forbid a man not want to kill animals. Needless to say, he was the only one of us that was married. She also knows and can conceptualize what is and would be expected from her in a vanilla heterosexual dynamic, her availability for sex without her pleasure, and she rejects it.
Grey is not the only love interest in this film, as I hinted earlier. Peter is Lee's childhood friend, a bit of a nutcase himself, with him explaining that he suffered a nervous breakdown while she was in the hospital and is... well, he's perfectly sweet for the most part, but he's clearly not right for Lee, inverting a classic rom-com trope of the best friend who waits for you being the perfect match. If Secretary explores Lee's journey of self-discovery and is intertwined with her exploration of her own desires, which are often at odds with the expectations placed on her by society, Peter is a physical representative of those expectations. He works a dead-end job like her father, lives with and is close with his parents, who immediately suggest marriage on their first meeting, and keeps the mentally shaky Lee in a space of inert girlhood. These are perfectly valid choices for someone else, of course, but they're not right for Lee, and she knows that. She even tries to acquiesce to these expectations at first, pursuing a relationship with Peter and even attempting to masturbate to the memory of their first sex attempt, and indeed her first date with him, a peculiar combination of a diner and a laundrette, a potential replication of the chores associated with womanhood, cooking and cleaning for others. But much like her failed sex attempt, where Lee isn't interested in intimacy outside of being spanked and talked down to, it doesn't work. She cannot occupy that space of normative heterosexuality that everyone is seemingly pushing onto her, because she finds alternative and, quite frankly, far more stimulating pleasure in the sexless but deeply erotic encounters she has with Grey, being spanked and humiliated, tied up, made to crawl on all fours, control her eating, etc. She would rather masturbate to the inert yet phallic stand-in of their BDSM dynamic, Grey's red marker, than pursue an unfulfilling sexual relationship with Peter. This sexlessness of their dynamic is even referenced outright by Grey in their second in-depth on-screen scene.
You're not worried that I'm going to fuck you, are you? I'm not interested in that, not in the least.
In spite of his clear desire for her, Grey is not interested in having sex with Lee, and arguably, Lee doesn't care that much about having sex with him either, since she masturbates in the earlier scene just at the idea of being close to Grey, being held by him, being his secretary. And continuing on the theme of masturbation, they find enjoyment in their own bodies as a result of this scene, prioritizing their own pleasures while facilitating their BDSM dynamic with words and actions alone.
I really find this scene fascinating because Secretary was released over 20 years ago and is quite literally the text for most people when it comes to BDSM and fetish on screen, and it was already posing radical questions about consent, desire, misogyny, and women removing themselves from relationships where their sole purpose is to fulfill the desire for sex with men, to instead prioritize the mental and romantic stimulation of alternative, maybe even asexual relationships over the pursuit of what is traditionally taught in normative heterosexual relationships.
It is perhaps this overlying facet of Secretary, eroticism as opposed to outright sex, which makes almost every other romantic or erotic film about BDSM all the more frustrating to watch. Whether that be the earlier discussed and quite harmless 50 Shades of Grey franchise, or the utterly toothless recent release Baby Girl, because most of these films see BDSM, or kink as a whole, as a hurdle to a normative relationship, something to be negotiated, reconsidered, put up with before the ultimate fulfillment of penetrative and importantly procreative heterosexual sex, as opposed to a facet of it or even a replacement for it, they end up just really lacking as movies about fetish and movies as a whole. Romance and chemistry and even essential thesis statements regarding power dynamics and desire take a back seat, so the filmmakers can scandalize the audience with boring set pieces and normie bondage gear that'll get posted and talked about on social media through a tone of puritanical outrage. Jesus, how did Maggie Gyllenhaal and James Spader manage to turn us on in 2002 with mashed potatoes, 4 peas and all the ice cream you can eat, while other films can't do that with multiple outright sex scenes?
I mean, it is James Spader. It's kind of unfair to compare him to anyone else, really. He just is really above it all in terms of eroticism. And look, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm being unfair as a whole, since I'm clearly writing from a very strong bias. But, and I must insist this isn't necessarily me saying that every film about fetish has to end like Secretary, or even have that positive an outlook to BDSM as it does.
For example, The Piano Teacher does a masterful job depicting the power dynamics between men and women through the guise of BDSM going wrong, used as a tool for self-harm and self-degradation before ultimately being a tool for imposed harm and ultimate degradation and sexual assault, using BDSM as an excuse to do so. Similarly, The Duke of Burgundy depicts the often fetishized but seldom legitimized lesbian BDSM relationship, as well as the rare on-screen submissive leading and orchestrating the scenes, a more true-to-life depiction of BDSM IRL. The Duke of Burgundy ends a little more cheerfully than The Piano Teacher, of course, but that too suggests the potential difficulty of BDSM and the strain it can put on a relationship when two people don't see eye to eye when it comes to fetish and kink. There can be and are interesting narratives to be explored about sex and violence, and what can happen when people connect the two in the space of kink and fetish, both through the lens of romance and psychological drama or horror.
Good Girl by Anna Fitzpatrick even reflects on the warped view that Secretary created about BDSM for its protagonist Lucy, who yearns for a fulfilled relationship with fetish included, while navigating the complicated spaces of power dynamics between men and women, especially in the workplace. Which is sort of what Secretary is about.
Gray, in all of his pathetic glory, is still an older man and Lee's employer, and he has a considerable amount of power over a vulnerable woman that he could use for nefarious purposes if he wanted to. As I mentioned, the Secretary short story leans more into that space, with Debbie needing to grapple with her maybe dubiously consensual arousal as a result of her workplace abuse, and what it means for her to feel pleasure at all when she is being taken advantage of. So it's not a surprise that Gateskill has some mixed feelings about the cinematic adaptation softening the complexities of her text, writing, "We are meant to realise that S&M here is not only painless, it's therapeutic. It's made both characters more confident, better looking, happier, freer, and self-actualised."
I do understand Gateskill's critiques on the film, and even agree that the film's need to soften the complexities of BDSM displays what Emily Spires writes as BDSM becoming connected with a neoliberal inflected narrative of self-actualisation, which facilitates the successful coupling of two initially dysfunctional characters in a middle-class, gender-normative, monogamous union. I do think that's an entirely fair critique on the film, despite what I'm about to argue. But I do also, perhaps selfishly, have some level of appreciation that the film softened the source material into a screenplay where Lee does have a considerable amount of agency, and even instigates most of the scenes between herself and Gray.
Instead of exploring the important, if complicated and deeply nuanced conversations of the original short story, something that was radical in 1988 and is still incredibly radical in the conservative politic of 2025, 5, Secretary as a film positions BDSM and fetish as being a wholly positive thing in both Lee and Gray's lives, something that allows them to center themselves and each other in the overtly heterosexualized spaces they occupy, in spite of what other, less interesting narratives might suggest or be structured towards. And it's encouraging to hear that this was the intention going through the film. Supposedly, Shainberg was confounded by the requirement that Lee recover from her predilection for BDSM, and he observed that the film's depiction of BDSM as healing instead of as a problem was entirely antithetical to the Hollywood point of view, which therefore made it all the more appealing to oppose.
It's genuinely crazy how it feels that we've gone backwards on a statement made in 2002. Like, it blows my mind. And the thing is, I don't think that Secretary, in spite of its more upbeat and outright comedic tone, maybe softening the original text complexities surrounding gender and power, is necessarily suggesting anything in the opposite direction of the original story. That dominance and submission between men and women is apolitical, or can be entirely removed from the societal background of purveying patriarchy, much like the earlier discussed conversations I had about women enjoying horror and romance movies as a whole.
I feel that the film is very conscious about this, since a large crux of its conflict comes from Gray having a crisis in conscience, putting an end to their dynamic after doing things he views as disgusting, and taking advantage of his power as a stand-in patriarch for Lee, despite the opposite clearly being true. While Lee happily learns more about her interests, listening to a tape on how to come out as a submissive, Gray spirals and experiences what we would now label dom drop, in which dominants might question their performance or ponder if they have pushed too far.
You have to go, or I won't stop.
Don't.
I cannot do this anymore.
But I want to know you.
Much like Lee, Gray has been conditioned by society's expectations of manhood and the subsequent expectations to fit into the mould that patriarchy has created for him. But he can't. He cannot acclimate to these expectations when he's being truly authentic to his personhood, resulting in a previous unhappy marriage that we see the fallout of, and an awkward discomfort surrounding his authority towards Lee when she begins to express her attraction towards him. Where Lee finds fulfillment in removing herself from her family's expectations of her and centering her own pleasure, Gray finds fulfillment in nurturing and caring for the person that Lee is becoming. And the fact that this doesn't fit into the patriarchal idea of manhood might arguably be the cause of his dom drop and the film's main conflict. Hell, when he breaks it off with Lee, he throws away the one phallic symbol we see in the film, his red marker pen, as it is seemingly better to reject manhood entirely than it is to embrace a different interpretation of it.
And this is a little off subject, but this discomfort and refusal to fit into their strictly gendered molds, as well as their general awkwardness and trouble with communication, has also resulted in many modern viewers reading both Gray and Lee as autistic, which also makes their proclivity towards BDSM in lieu of vanilla sex all the more interesting, when research suggests that BDSM may be especially appealing to autistic people due to the sensory and practical aspects and the inherently transgressive nature of BDSM and kink.
Secretary is not arguing that BDSM is removed from patriarchy because, is anything? Instead, I feel that Secretary suggests that it is perhaps the persistent bite of patriarchy that makes these power dynamics so appealing to some, which is also what the original text explores and has been explored for as long as the romance genre has existed, dating back to Orientalist non-con kink in 1919, dowries and enemies to lovers in 1813, or the ultimate virtuous good girl in the first romance novel ever in 1740. But rather than positioning the dynamics of male domination and female submission as something within the norm, something to be expected and put up with from a good wife, Secretary suggests instead that womanhood and manhood really can and should exist and be enjoyed outside of the space of the heterosexist expectations that Lee and Gray's dynamic is a foil to. Even after being rejected by the man of her dreams, turned away due to his own fears, and momentarily forcing herself to acclimate to these discussed expectations, Lee should be allowed to run away from a man she has no interest in marrying, even if he is perfectly nice to her, barring the expected fulfillment of her role as a wife and mother. She should be allowed to piss herself in a wedding dress, degrading the institute of marriage as a whole, and degrading those who would force those institutes upon her more so than Grey ever could, and she should be allowed to pursue the things she wants. Feminist theory, heterosexual expectation, God himself be damned. In the climax of the film, Lee maybe hallucinates her literal patriarch, her father, releasing her from his care and his expectations for her to continue as his maternal caregiver as she had been, his stand-in mother, the archetype of womanhood within patriarchy, with a Bible verse, word from the Uber patriarchy, in order to pursue a life of pleasure for herself. And it's touching.
You are the child of God's holy gift of life. You come from me, but you are not me. Your soul and your body are your own, and yours to do with as you wish.
Thank you, Daddy.
Secretary is not so progressive as to suggest that heterosexuality will ever be removed from the power dynamics between men and women, because I don't think they ever will be. But it is progressive in suggesting that there is value in choosing a life removed from the societal expectations that heterocentric cultures has on those relationships. And while it might not be completely woke in that regard, nor does it posit the eye-rolling in-text conversations surrounding female masochism and male domination that other texts do.
What we do is, if we continue to do this, it's normal, as long as it's consensual.
What does that mean?
It's about giving and taking power, no?
Come on. What did you do? Go to a library, look that up?
Female masochism is nothing but a male fantasy. It's a male construct.
No, you're wrong. That's a dated idea.
Dated idea?
Yeah, it's a dated idea of sexuality.
Why do you want to punish me?
Anna.
Why do you want to hurt me? Why?
Anna, stop.
Why do you need to?
Because it's the way I am!
Because I'm 50 shades of fucked up.
You're beautiful.
Beautiful. This is the skin of a killer, Bill.
I think that makes it all the more powerful and deeply romantic.
Lee runs away from her wedding with Peter and admits to Grey that she is in love with him. While he is utterly stunned at her honesty and is clearly still struggling with his attraction to her, he tasks her with the ultimate BDSM scene, sitting at his desk for an undisclosed amount of time, a test of her loyalty and his. Whether diegetically or non-diegetically, it's kind of dealer's choice in that. Lee is visited by people. Her mother, Peter's mother, a feminist theorist who lectures her on women's suffrage, Grey's ex-wife, who initially shun her desires before agreeing on the ultimate conclusion and resounding thesis statement of the film.
You know, Lee, there's a long history of this in Catholicism. You are part of a great tradition. Who's to say that love needs to be soft and gentle?
At the end of a 3-day stand-in, the grand gesture that is commonplace in any rom-com or romance movie, and reading a statement from Lee that,
in one way or another, I've always suffered. I don't know why exactly, but I do know that I'm not so scared of suffering now, and I've found someone to feel with, to play with, to love, in a way that feels right for me. I hope he knows that I can see that he suffers too, and that I want to love him.
Grey admits to himself that he truly wants a relationship with Lee, and he wants to pursue their sadomasochistic pleasure together. He puts an end to their prolonged scene, and he cares for her like any good dom should, giving her the drink he spotted on her desk, bathing her, washing her hair, and allowing her to bask in the subspace of the ultimate BDSM scene. Lee is a purple orchid blooming in the grass, returned to the earth, and Grey nurtures her just as he did his flowers through the film. Lee is finally given permission to center the things she wants, and Grey too is permitted to care and nurture and touch without fear of society's expectations surrounding it.
And though spires rightfully identified that it is their supposedly subversive BDSM dynamic that led Lee and Grey into the space of marriage and middle-class domesticity, where they are just like every other couple, as Lee herself observes, Lee and Grey's marriage is consummated outside of the space of religion and puritanical belief structures, and through the present lens of Lee's sexual agency and desire.
Lee even goes so far as to wear a black wedding dress in their only sex scene, countering the white dress she degraded in her fetishistic grand gesture, and presenting herself, finally, away from the pinks and purples of her girlhood and embracing the hues of her womanhood. In the final scenes of the film, Lee and Gray are any other couple. But while they are surrounded by playing children, there remains zero inclination that they will have their own. And the film finishes, after a well-placed bug on the bedspread, emphasising that their fetishistic dynamic continues, even in idyllic suburbia, with Lee looking into the camera, centering us, as we did from the beginning, on this being her story and no one else's.
The podcast You Are Good, hosted by Sarah Marshall and Alex Steed, describes Secretary as a fairy tale as opposed to a genuine representation of BDSM. And it genuinely feels just like that. A sumptuously erotic, deeply touching and intimately personal film that suggests pleasure above all else.
Pleasure in submission, pleasure in domination, pleasure in pain, humiliation, a single scoop of creamed potatoes and 4 peas on a dinner plate. But more than simply being pleasurable, Secretary is and remains, at least in my opinion, a fundamentally radical film that is yet to be even comparable to anything else in the genre in terms of quality. It masterfully entwines intense eroticism with a distinctive and rarely matched depiction of female pleasure and agency, subjects that we still to this day struggle to understand. Through its nuanced portrayal of Lee and Gray's relationship and their dynamic, the film offers compelling explorations about gender, sexuality, patriarchy, and power. It challenges conventional norms and invites viewers to delve into how these forces shape desire, control, and ultimately liberation as a whole.
And while I can certainly understand some of the criticisms, I don't think there's a problem with giving oneself over to pleasure every now and then.